Hi, this is our first lesson in Chapter 4, and our Chapter 4 is all about sampling and experiments. So, as we look at this chapter, you can see a list here of the things that we'll talk about, things that we'll learn. Why sample when you're doing a survey, how to design a survey by randomly selecting participants, really how to perform a survey by randomly selecting participants, how surveys can go wrong, so trying to make surveys that are fair and that will get you realistic data, how to design a sound experiment, how experiments help determine causation, which is an important thing, really. We can say that two factors are related, as we just talked about in our last chapter, but how can we tell whether one makes the other happen? An experiment is the way. And lastly, what can go wrong with experiments? And we have the word confounding there. And maybe you've heard old-fashioned cartoons, they say, confound it all. That just means things are going wrong, okay? The results aren't clear, okay? Something is jumbled up. And those are the kinds of things that we'll be talking about in this chapter. Today, our focus is going to be on why statisticians use samples, and then it says how not to do that. So we're going to hopefully give you some good tips for sampling today. The reasons for sampling are usually could all be wrapped up in this last thing I'm going to write, which is practicality. And it's hard for me to not want to talk here. You sample, folks, because in many cases it's not practical or not feasible or totally impossible to census or to get information from each member of a population. So people sample because it saves time, because it saves money often, and because sometimes it's just not practical or possible to census or to ask every individual in a population. So we've already kind of delved into the vocabulary, and I used the word population and census several times there. A population is the entire group that you're interested in studying, everyone, okay? So it might be all of high school students in America, or it might be the entire student body here at Clio High School. The entire group is a population. A unit is an individual in the population. And as we've said before many times, they call individual members of the population subjects, but unit is another word for that. A census gathers information from the entire, or tries to gather info from the entire population, while a sample gathers info from just a subset of the population, hoping that the information you get from your sample will apply to the entire population. So you gather info from a subset, hoping that your subset models the real population. Okay? These two words, parameter and statistic, are very closely related. A parameter is a measure from the population, or some fact. You might think it's some fact from the population. A measurement for a population. A statistic is a measurement from a sample. And when we say measurement, we may be talking about such things as mean, median, right? A population can certainly have a mean and a median, but very often they'd be hard to find. Okay, because you can't always get data from every individual member. However, samples statistics are much easier to find because it's a smaller group of information, body of information that you're working with. So we'd like to ask you to use your judgment on a couple of incidents here. So we want you to vote, and it's no fair if you listen to mine before you make your vote. So will you pause the video, read these please, and see whether you think a census or a sample is more appropriate. I'll tell you what, I'm going to want a census here. I think an automotive company should be inspecting every car, not just every other or every fifth, okay? It should inspect every car, my opinion. On this count, If a cookie producer is looking to count the number of chocolate chips in every cookie, they will destroy their population. This cannot be done in a census form. You can't crumble every cookie to count its chips. This has to be a sample. The next one, the U.S. president is determined by an election. That should be a census, folks. As you know, in reality, it does not turn out to be a census because there are millions of people who do not vote, which I do not understand. But a census is the way that we choose our president. It's supposed to be by a majority win. Unless you start thinking about the Electoral College. Weekly movie attendance figures are released each Sunday. Well, they are, folks, but if they counted every moviegoer who was in a theater the previous week, it would take them probably months to compile all that data. This is done by sampling. Okay, they pick some theaters at random and count how many tickets were sold for each movie in the theater. The last one, I think there's a little argument on both sides of this. In Los Angeles, which is a huge city, if they want to do in-depth interviews with teachers, then that means they're going to be talking to a whole lot of people. Okay, I can see where a census could be done because it is possible to talk to each teacher. However, I think a sampling would probably be a better choice here, especially since they're saying in-depth, because that implies a lot of time. And spending a lot of time with a lot of teachers may be hard to do. All right. Today we want to talk or introduce you to the term bias. And we know, or we have a feel for what bias means. Some other synonyms for it: prejudice or slant. Maybe not done maliciously, because when we think prejudice, we think that somebody's doing that because they're mean or nasty. But prejudice just means that you have a preformed opinion, and that kind of is what bias is all about, looking at data through a given slant or a different perspective. Bias can be introduced into sampling in two different ways. By either the way you select your sample, that would be sample selection bias. So this would be bias introduced through the sample selection method. And as you can see, there are several types of sample selection bias that statisticians have to be afraid of and aware of. The first is called size bias, and I will say this before I attempt to write it. Size bias occurs when there is a group in the population that has a large number of people, maybe larger than all the rest. So they get picked more frequently just because there are more of them. That's size bias. Okay? A segment of the population gets chosen more frequently because there are just more of them to choose. If you think about that in terms of our high school here, because there are more of them to choose. If we were doing some kind of a study that got the opinions of seniors versus the opinions of underclassmen, and we tried, there are way more underclassmen than there are seniors. So if we were selecting randomly, we'd pick more underclassmen just because there are more of them. Okay. The next of the sample selection biases is called voluntary response bias. And folks, I generally think of this in terms of call-in surveys or online surveys where the people who respond, they really care deeply about the issue. They wouldn't respond if they didn't. A voluntary response bias, again, a way to think about it is it happens in online or phone-in surveys. The only people who respond are those with strong feelings, okay? The people who respond. So there are lots of us that may read something on Facebook or whatever, and it just goes right over our head. You have to really care deeply to answer a survey if no one's face to face with you saying, please answer my question. The people who respond have usually extreme opinions. So you get the yes, I'm way for it people, or the no, I'm way against it people. Okay, they're the ones who care enough to respond. A convenience sample bias, folks, is caused by choosing a sample just because they're easy to get to. Okay, that might be, I want to prove that the lunches here at Clio High School are not nutritious, right? So to do that, I sit down at a table with 15 of my friends and say, how nutritious do you think the lunch is? Well, if I'm just asking those 15, that's a convenient sample. I haven't done a good job in selecting a sample that I think is representative. So a convenient sample bias is introduced by getting responses that are easy to get to. Again, convenient sample bias means that you've only gotten responses from folks who are easy to get to. You haven't gone out of your way to get a representative sample. When we say representative, of course, that's the goal. We want our sample to represent the population. A judgment sample, this one surprised me a little bit when I first learned about this, but there are companies whose job it is to sample folks, right? And sometimes just the way that those companies select samples, and it brings bias into a survey because they don't know the population as well as somebody who's more familiar with it, the person who's doing the study. So these are professionally done. So professionally selected samples. And the problem with that, again, is they don't know the population well enough to get a random sample. May not know the population well enough. So, we've said all of these things. Whoops. All right, so we've looked at all of these potential problems with survey data. So now we should talk about what an unbiased sampling method is. And an unbiased sampling method requires that each member of the population, has an equal likelihood of being selected. Okay? Each member of the population has an equal likelihood of being selected. And we'll talk later on this week about how you might accomplish that. Here's some questions for us to answer. Again, this might be a good place for you to stop the video, answer these questions, and see if you agree with me. Which kind of sample selection bias might be present? And then the question, will this estimate of the population parameter, will it be too high or too low based on the sample that's been selected? So the first one says, you use your statistics class to estimate the percentage of students in your school who study at least 2 hours a night. Well, if you think about the students who are in your class, you guys have signed up for an AP class, and not every student in Clio High School has the drive or desire or smarts to be in an AP class. So I think that this could cause some size selection bias because there are more good students in this class than there are in the population of the high school. A size bias. So if we chose you guys to be a representative of our high school, we'd be doing the rest of the school a disservice. Will we estimate the parameter too high or too low? Probably too high here, because most of you probably do a couple hours a night, okay, of homework or whatever. So we'd be estimating too high if we chose just from your class. The second, you send a survey to all people who've graduated from Clio in the past 10 years, which is good, okay? You use the mean annual income of those who reply. Oh, there's a problem. To estimate the mean annual income of all Clio grads. Folks, if you only get the mean annual incomes of those who choose to reply, this is voluntary response bias. Because they don't have to, and they only will send back your survey if they want to talk about how much money they make, right? This is voluntary response bias. And as far as how it would estimate the mean, I would guess, and this is just my opinion, that it would estimate it high because people who make money will want to tell you about it. So that's my opinion again. I think it would make a high estimate. The last of these three questions, you want to know the percent of voters who favor state funding for bilingual education. You use the phone book listing of residential phone numbers as your frame, and notice that that word frame is highlighted. That means the set of all your population units. So you're limiting, you're saying that your population would be represented by what's in the phone book. Folks, I don't think that that's going to work for you. I think that I would call this one a convenience sampling bias because it's easy to pick up the phone book. And it's not as easy to get out on foot and try and talk to everyone or to try and talk to a representative sample. As far as whether we'd estimate high or low, my guess here is that we would estimate low. Here's why. Because lots of people who would be in favor of state funding for bilingual education may not have a home phone. They may not be in the phone book. So I think that this would estimate low, and that again is just my opinion, but that's my thinking. All right, next we want to talk about response bias. Response bias comes from the way people answer your questions, okay? The first type, sample selection bias, was how the sample selected. Response bias is bias that's introduced by how people actually respond. How people respond. And the first type that we have listed here is non-response bias. Folks, this is very, very similar to voluntary response bias. Non-response bias would be you mailed out your survey to a bunch, but a chunk of your population doesn't answer your survey. Okay? You may have a wonderful survey and you may have selected a great random sample, but a chunk of them don't respond. They throw it away. Right? That's not something that you have control of. That's their response to you. Questionnaire bias has to do with the way questions are asked. Okay? And this is something that as the statistician you do have control over. So these are some things very important for us to look at when we're designing our own surveys. The first of these bullets, I'm going to say who's asking, okay? If you think about this, your response to a question might be very different if it was being asked by your friend versus a policeman, okay? And I'm not going to elaborate there. I'm going to just say think about that. It's very likely that you may be a little bit more open with your friend than you would to a policeman. Okay? Who's asking is important. The second of my bullet points, the attitude and appearance of the questioner. And I want to just think about this for a second. The attitude and appearance of the questioner. I'll tell you what, you would be, or you could be, intimidated by the attitude of someone who comes onto you very strongly, you know, who did that, right? Your answer to that question may be different based on the attitude of the person who's asking it or the appearance. You might put more weight in your answer if you were speaking to somebody who was dressed nicely, right, than if you had somebody who was dressed with holy jeans, right? Attitude and appearance, it's not supposed to matter to us, folks, but it does. Those things are important to people who are answering questions, and it changes the way that they would respond. The next of these elements that I've talked with you about is the order of the questions. Many surveys are trying to get you to respond in one way, right? They want you to respond in one way. So the questioner asks leading questions. An example might be, did you know that the federal government spends $15 million annually to pay da-da-da-da-da? And then the next question, should the government pay $15 million? Or it might be, did you know they pay $60 million? And then the next question, how much should the government spend? Those are leading questions, and the first question is designed to get you into a frame of mind where you will answer a specific way the second question. So the order of questions can introduce bias. And again, our job as statisticians is to not do that. We don't want to be leading somebody down the path that we want them to go. The last of my four things here are the wording of questions, and this is similar to the topic before. You want to think about the connotations of words that you use. I'm not trying to open any arguments here, but you realize that when people say pro-life and others say pro-choice, they're trying to make you think about the positives of their stands. There are connotations with the word pro. Just as if we said pro-abortion, it doesn't sound as friendly as pro-choice, okay? It may mean the same thing to many, but it doesn't sound as friendly. So the wording of questions can also introduce bias in a questionnaire. And then the last thing that we want to talk about here, incorrect response bias. Folks, this just means that people either lie or don't remember correctly, or they make something up. I like the people lie thing because it reminds me of that guy House that used to be on television. He said everybody lies. People lie. They may not be doing it on purpose. Again, they may have incorrect memory or selective memory, whatever, right? But incorrect response bias can also affect a survey or the results of a survey. You decide which question it says do you think brought out more support for public TV. A Reader's Digest poll asked Americans if they agree with the statement that it is not the government's job to financially support television programming. Or the poll also asked them if they'd be disappointed if Congress cut its funding for public TV. Which one do you think brought more support for public TV? I'm thinking the second. Okay, there's that word disappointed. Would you be disappointed? See, that's an emotional word. Would you be disappointed if Congress cut its funding? Cut? Oh my, that's a negative word. It's designed to make you think, well, of course we'd be disappointed, right? On the other hand, hardliners would say, no, it's not the government's job, right? In fact, we're hearing that a lot in today's economy. Words are so influential, folks, and I hope that this lesson has got you thinking about them. So we've introduced you to some vocabulary, given you some food for thought. Hope that you'll get out there and do that. You try it as quickly as you can, and we'll see you in school.